Williams began his broadcasting career at KATI Radio in Casper as a summer relief announcer and then as a reporter covering city and county government. At Stanford University in California, he was news director of the campus radio station, KZSU, covering the turmoil of the Vietnam protests in the early 1970s.
At Stanford this past week, it was learned that Angela Davis will be housed and tried in Santa Clara County. Good evening. I'm Pete Williams. Angela Davis remains in her two-cell area in Palo Alto.
When Interior Secretary Rogers Morton checked into the Stanford Medical Center for treatment, Pete scored an interview and asked about the Wounded Knee occupation, then in South Dakota. Morton harshly criticized the protesters and said he would not negotiate with them, quote, with a gun to my head. That comment caused a firestorm, and Morton was forced to retract it at a news conference the next day. In 1974, Pete was hired as the morning news anchor and city-county reporter for KTWO Television and Radio, later becoming news director. During more than a decade at K2, he covered local and state courts.
Did the amount of the damages surprise you?
Nothing surprises me about this case.
Why not?
Let me go get Steve. Because it's amazing.
And he reported on Wyoming politics.
Next week, Senator Hart himself may come here. His daughter is to be here this weekend. Walter Mondale's daughter is coming in time for the conventions, and the Glenn people still say some of Senator Glenn's relatives may be here too. Pete Williams, K2 News.
With the financial backing of K2 and Harrisco Broadcasting, he sued the Sweetwater County Justice of the Peace, who threw reporters out of a pre-trial hearing for Ed Cantrell, the Rock Springs Public Safety Director, accused of shooting an undercover drug agent in a patrol car. The Wyoming Supreme Court's ruling in the case established new standards for keeping pre-trial hearings open to the public. He also produced a series of primetime news documentaries, several on the energy industry.
We ask a simple question about Wyoming energy. Where do we stand?
And Pete offered inside looks at the workings of the legislature.
This is the State House chamber at the Capitol building in Cheyenne. Beginning in early January and continuing until last Friday, this was one of the busiest places in the state.
His 1979 documentary, A Man to Match His Mountains, told the inspiring story of climber Glenn Exum, who opened the first climbing school and guide service in the Tetons.
There is more to the Tetons than can be measured by the geologist, or described by the poet, or painted by the artist. After all, there are higher mountains. Not far away is Wyoming's Gannett Peak, taller by 20 feet than the Grand. Other mountain ranges are longer and wider. Even so, there is something extra. The Tetons arrest the eye and take the breath away, as no other range in North America can. So it is not surprising that men have come to climb these mountains. First came the pioneers, who found the routes to the top. Glenn Exum climbed by what we now call the Exum Ridge. He is honored for the way he touched the rock. But he is admired for the way he touches people. He discovered the joy of the Grand Teton for himself when he was 19 years old, and has since spent a lifetime helping others to find it for themselves. He climbed his new route in 1931, when he was 20. In July 1981, at the age of 70, he climbed the Grand again, perhaps for the last time. Other climbers of the Tetons may be stronger and faster, just as other mountain ranges may be wider and longer. But Glenn Exum and the Tetons have something in common. There is something magical and uplifting about them. This is the story of a mountain 13,766 feet tall, and of a man who lives his life by reaching as high as he can.
In 1979, Pete was hired by National Public Radio to co-anchor the launch of its early news program, Morning Edition.
Medical officials in Dallas, Texas, say a British author has strong evidence that the man who shot John Kennedy in 1963 was a Soviet KGB agent posing as Lee Harvey Oswald. Good morning. From National Public Radio, this is Morning Edition with Pete Williams and Mary Tillotson.
But it was not to be. The entire staff was fired 3 weeks later as part of a purge at NPR's headquarters. Pete returned to Casper and K2, where his old job of news director was still open.
Here's an entry from the official minutes of the city of Casper.
In fact, Pete came and went from K2 so many times, this button was distributed at one of his going-away parties. But in the mid-'80s, he left K2 for the last time to become press secretary for Wyoming Congressman Dick Cheney. 3 years to the day after he was hired, things changed dramatically for him when George H.W. Bush chose Cheney to be Secretary of Defense.
Do solemnly swear.
For Pentagon spokesman, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, Cheney chose Pete. He became a trusted advisor to Cheney and senior military officials, and was a familiar face during the U.S. operation in Panama and the first Gulf War in 1990 and 91.
The crucial question, how many missile launchers do they have left? Here now is Pete Williams, the Defense Department spokesman.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A couple of announcements for you, but I'm going to defer them until after we hear from General Kelly and Admiral McConnell so that we don't hold them here. They're very busy this afternoon. It's clearly the Geneva Conventions were worked out before the era of satellite communications and worldwide radio broadcasting.
At the end of the Bush administration in 1993, Pete returned to broadcasting and joined us here at NBC in Washington, where our former bureau chief, Tim Russert, assigned him to cover the Justice Department and the Supreme Court. He reported on some of this country's biggest spy cases, including the treachery of Aldrich Ames at the CIA. And he broke the story of the arrest of Robert Hansen at the FBI.
Investigators say he was arrested Sunday night in the suburban Washington Park in Virginia after dropping off a package of classified information for his Russian handlers. Investigators say he would signal a drop by putting strips of tape here on this sign.
Pete led our reporting on the FBI's efforts to find and prosecute the Oklahoma City bombers.
NBC's Pete Williams has been following this investigation from the beginning at the Justice Department. Pete, where do we go from here?
Tom, the investigation will continue to take two tracks. The first is the search for physical evidence on the scene, like the pieces of the truck, like parts of the explosive device or the material that was used to make it. That'll be very important when the case goes to trial, that kind of physical evidence.
Like many of us at NBC News, he was deeply involved in reporting on the investigation into the nation's worst terror attack on September 11th, 2001.
Federal agents respond immediately. More than 4,000 FBI special agents and 3,000 support staff already on the case, sweeping the nation for evidence.
He covered the trial of Zacarias Moussaoui, sent to the U.S. to be part of a second wave of attacks. Testimony included the first details of what happened to the 9/11 flight that crashed in Pennsylvania.
The government played the final half hour of sound recorded inside the Boeing 757 cockpit.
United 93, United 903, do you hear Cleveland?
46 minutes into the flight, piloted by Captain Jason Dahl, the hijackers break in. At 9:31, Ziad Jarrah, now at the controls, speaks into his microphone.
The captain, please sit down. Keep remaining sitting. We have a ball aboard. So it's
The hijackers then struggle with someone in the cockpit, apparently a woman. Investigators say it was likely a flight attendant. "Don't hurt me, I don't want to die," a voice says.
In 2007, Pete revealed the contents of a video sent to NBC News by the student who killed 32 people at Virginia Tech.
Well, Brian, after seeing all this material, it's clear why the profilers have compared Cho Seung-Hui to the students who shot their classmates at Columbine High School. In forceful language, he expresses the same kind of me against the world attitude.
Just minutes after firing 2 fatal shots at the Virginia Tech dormitory on Monday, Cho Seung-Hui returned to his own dorm room and made the final preparations to mail what appears to be a video confession.
When the time came, I did it. I had to.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
And as the nation prepared to inaugurate its first African-American president, Pete explained the unusually tight security arrangements around Washington.
all right, bring us in, Mark.
On the water, the U.S. Coast Guard is pushing its fast patrol boats even further out than it did for past inaugurals. It's partly a response to November's terror attack in Mumbai. The men responsible for it arrived by boat.
But not all his reporting on the law enforcement beat has been so serious. He offered this look at a fading piece of Americana, familiar to anyone who ever watched a police drama.
What's your 1020?
10-code talk started in the 30s to minimize chatter on crowded police radios, but now it's becoming a lost language.
The problem is that police departments speak different dialects of the 10 code, and when they respond together to an emergency, have trouble understanding each other.
Stand by. 10-4.
Everybody knows 10-4, but how about 10-90? In Newport News, Virginia, it means robbery alarm. In nearby Hampton, it's a bathroom break.
10-4.
Who's killing the 10 codes? Police chiefs themselves, insisting their officers speak on the radio plainly.
This is an NBC News special report. Battle for the White House. Here is Tom Brokaw.
Good evening, everyone. It is 10 o'clock on the 12th of December, the year 2000. The U.S. Supreme Court has just released its ruling in one of the most important decisions it will make in its modern history.
The entire nation was focused on Pete's reporting on the titanic legal battle over who would be elected president of the United States, George Bush or Al Gore. It all came down to the 9 justices of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether Florida could continue recounting disputed ballots.
Can you find any language in there in which the U.S. Supreme Court is instructing the Florida Supreme Court, or for that matter, instructing the Florida Supreme Court to say to the state legislature in Florida, give us better standards?
No, I think, Tom, unless I am missing it here entirely, I think that they are not contemplating the recount. I think that the language of further proceedings not inconsistent with this opinion. At this point, Tom, I would have to say this is housekeeping language. Tidy up the loose ends, they're saying. But clearly the court talked about the idea that we heard them discussing in public in the oral argument. Send this back, ask them to try again. But as I read this majority opinion, Tom, on the fly, it looks to me like the court is the majority opinion. The opinion of the court is saying, we just can't do that.
Any more conclusions based on your quick reading of this 35-page decision?
Yes, especially from the dissent, Tom. The senior justice dissenting here, Justice John Paul Stevens, I think, leaves little doubt that there's no room for a recount. So does Justice David Souter. Justice Souter says, and we think that he's talking about what could have happened.
Pete, let's just stop. If there is no room for a recount, this election is over for Vice President Al Gore. All of his political aides and his closest legal advisors were saying if they lose on the recount question, it's over. And that's effectively what you're saying.
I see nothing that in any way is incompatible with that, Tom.
The man who became president, George W. Bush, wrote in his memoir that he discovered he had won the election by watching NBC. Bush wrote, "I listened intently as Pete Williams of NBC News deciphered the Supreme Court's verdict." And he added, "I probably became the first person to learn he had won the presidency while lying in bed with his wife watching TV." I'm Andrea Mitchell. From all of his colleagues here in the Washington Bureau of NBC News, congratulations to our own Pete Williams for being inducted into the Wyoming Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Way to go, Pete.
Hey folks, Brian Williams here, NBC Nightly News, the other Williams here in New York, and I'm holding in my hand some very, very disturbing news. We tried not to show this to you. I would normally at this point say to my brother Pete, the 80s called and they want the look back, but the good graphics folks in Wyoming have done that work for us. The tragic news, while Pete has moved on in terms of personal grooming, in terms of clothing, the tragic news is these were his first run glass frames of choice until about 2 years ago when he made a trip to the local lens crafters in the mall there just outside D.C. Disturbing stuff. I'm sorry to show this and share this with the good people of Wyoming who all these years later have finally rid themselves of the memories of what this man looked like on local news. Here's the truth. One of the best guys I've ever known, and if you ask anybody at NBC News, New York, Washington, any of our bureaus, foreign or domestic, they'll tell you the same thing. We would all trust the guy to raise our children. We trust him implicitly and absolutely. His word is gold around here. And in the news business, especially these days, all the electronics, personal and otherwise, there has to be a human element. There's got to be a guy you can call, pick up the phone, say, check out this story, and then his word has to win. because at the end of the day, you need smart people, experienced people with heart and soul to make judgments like that. He's our guy. I understand his mom truly believes there's some DNA connection, that we could be somehow lost brothers. I will take the shared last name and the fact that generations ago, probably in Wales, somebody had a wild night. They came over in separate boats. Let's go with that version. You are so lucky to claim him from your state, and it's a wonderful thing to hear about this honor. All of us are proud to know him. What an excellent choice you've made tonight. And Pete, congratulations.
Good evening. I want to join all of you there in Jackson to welcome Pete Williams into the Wyoming Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. I can't think of anybody who's more deserving of the honor. Pete and I have worked together going back to our days in the Congress when he became my press secretary in the mid-1980s. He did a superb job for me on Capitol Hill. And when I became Secretary of Defense, he took over as the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs. At Defense, we went through everything from Operation Just Cause in Panama to Desert Storm in the Persian Gulf. Pete had a tremendous ability because of his background and because of his knowledge and judgment to be able to participate in all of my sensitive meetings, but then to go out and make sound judgments about what could be publicized and could be talked about in open session and what had to remain secret. I've never seen anybody who was more effective in that kind of role or had better rapport with the press when oftentimes the tension between government on the one hand and the journalism community on the other was especially high. But he did a superb job. I've tried a number of times to hire him since without success. He had the good sense to stay at NBC when I was doing some other things. I especially remember the night in 2000 at the end of the 37-day recount in the election of 2000, especially focused on the state of Florida. That night, the Supreme Court put out the word that they were about to hand down their decision in the case, and I was alone in my house in McLean when I received the news, but it was dark, cold, rainy. It was one of those nights when the decision, which was very complex and hard for anybody to understand, needed an interpreter. And I quickly skimmed through the channels until I found Pete, and he was, as I suspected, the first one on the scene with the decision, the first one who was able to quickly get through it and understand the significance of it, and then finally announce who'd won the case and therefore who had in fact prevailed in the 2000 presidential election. It was, needless to say, an important night from my standpoint. I know Pete would have called it the other way had that been the decision of the court, but his remarkable breadth of experience and understanding of the complexities of our system has been a tremendous advantage over the years. He's been a great friend to me. I have enormous respect for him. I want to wish him the very best this evening as he receives a very high honor. So congratulations, Pete, and good night.